All right, welcome everybody. So when COVID started, I was all alone in my home and didn't know what I was going to do. And then I started teaching this class, and it was such a lifesaver. It was such a lifeline for me to have this sort of portal to do what I love to do, which is to study Torah with people throughout the pandemic, and started doing this every week. And then it just became a thing of its own. It was a way of escaping the solitude, and then it became like something more. It became really the anchor of my week, and I'm so grateful for this class, which has lasted beyond, well, are we beyond COVID? I guess we're not totally beyond COVID, but we're in a different era now. And I say all that just because one of the great things that's developed from this class is the ability now to teach it wherever I am. Used to be that if I was out of town, I just couldn't teach a class. But with this class, um, I can sneak off as I did last night to visit my friend in Sacramento. So that's where I am right now, and I'm in his room, hence the different I feel I must justify whenever I have a different background. So that's all by way of saying that I'm in a different place, and it's such a gift to be able to still in this random back room in my friend's house to be able to teach the Parsha and be able to learn the Parsha with you, not to miss a week. So let's get into it with gratitude to God for these little portals, for the Torah itself, and for these little portals, these new mechanisms that we have for sure. When they printed the book, that was like, whoa, there's a new way to share Torah. And it came up with a printing press. So same here. This new technology is allowing me to study Torah, even in the I wouldn't say the remote parts of this is the capital of California, but wherever I am. All right, so let's say a blessing, and then I want to take you into a very complicated and kind of wondrous piece of Torah, which I haven't totally figured out. So I'm excited to work this through with you all. So let's say a blessing, thanking God for our for this space that we have together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so I want to say that I had like a big um Kiddush that I wrote about this week, a big insight into the counting of the Omer, which is what we are currently in the midst of in here in the land of mitzvot. It is the great fortune of our reading cycle that we always read the commandment to count the Omer on the during the period in which we count the Omer. Now, that's not so remarkable since it's a period which is 49 days long. So we have 7 weeks to cover it, but it is an exciting moment to be doing something in the calendar year, and then suddenly to have the Torah speaking about it as we read it. That's not usually true, even when we read the holidays. And in fact, the reason that it comes up, like we don't read we don't just happen to be on the reading for Passover or Rosh Hashanah when we're reading the Torah. So we have special holiday readings, right? Because we want to read about those things. But here's an example of just like as our cycle of the Torah goes, we read about something that we're currently doing, the counting of the Omer. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that is. We'll just do a little refresher on what that is. But I this week, as you many of you know, I'm writing a weekly Parsha essay for Hadar, and this week I wrote about a connection that I think provides a whole layer, maybe the primary layer of meaning in the Omer that I think is completely or overlooked. And I think it's important because the Omer, the counting of the Omer, we'll soon talk about where it all comes from, but as we experience it as a mitzvah, it's just counting. We just count every single day. And today, I should say, is the correct me if I'm wrong, 23rd day of the Omer, which makes 3 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. Okay. So that already tells you a lot about the practice, which is for 49 days, I said, we count every day. And as you just noticed, we don't just count the days, we also count the weeks. Okay. And that feature of our ritual comes from the language of the commandment itself, which mentions both weeks and days. Let's look at that now. And the last thing that I'll just say to introduce us is that what is to explain what an omer is. And an omer is quite simply a unit of volume. A unit of volume that in particular is used in the measuring of collected grain. Okay. So when you go, I'm certainly like far removed from the agricultural cycle, but I know enough from my calendar to know that there's a planting and then a cutting and then a gathering. That's sort of the way that we divide up the harvest into the cutting and the gathering. And then once you've gathered the grains and they're ready to be offered, you bundle them up into amounts, and the omer was the standard unit of measurement. Okay. So that's all we need to, we could get like more technical about it, but that's all we need to know to take us into our Parsha this week, Parshat Emor, which I should just say, as a kind of related, but I should just say it really loudly because it's a really good thing to know. Parshat Emor is notable in the Torah for containing the first full calendar, the first layout of all of the biblical holidays, starting actually with Shabbat, which is a holiday but is weekly, but then moving from Passover, Pesach, through to not Purim. That's like the last holiday on our calendar, but that's a later Purim and Hanukkah are later insertions. They're not in the Torah, and so the calendar moves from Passover all the way through Shavuot, actually, because of the way that it works out. Passover is the first holiday, and sorry, I just said that wrong. All the way through Sukkot, which is Passover is in the spring, and we run all the way through Shavuot, and then the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur holidays, and then Sukkot, because there are in the Torah there are basically 5 major holidays. There are the 3 festivals, some of which are a week long and have a holiday on each end, and then there's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Okay, so let's not get too tangled in there, but I just want to show you the passage that gives us the Omer, the counting of the Omer. And now that you understand that there's a kind of agricultural element to it, it will make a little more sense to you that we begin by collecting an Omer, like putting it forward, offering it up with the first Omer that we are able to grow. And I say we, but the Torah is speaking to those Israelites who first come into the land, the new land, and it tells them, this is what you should do when you come into the new land. Okay, so let's look at some, if you are a counter of the Omer, you will find these verses familiar because some of us even say them, just recite them before we count the Omer. A ritual which is done nightly and involves the blessing and then the formula of days and weeks. So let's take a look at where that emerges here. And oh, let me give you that sheet as well so that you can click onto it. I don't actually know if anyone ever needs the separate sheet, but because I screen share it, but I'm going to give it out anyway, because this way, anyway, you have it and you can refer to it whenever you want. So here in the chat is the source sheet for today. Okay. Cool. Uh-huh. I just saw a comment from Hannah about not counting at night. So we're not going to go through all of the halachot, the laws of counting the Omer, but please ask them if as they come up. And so I'm happy for this question. And the quick answer to what Hannah's talking about here, if one forgets to count at night, um, it's good. Like this is a little bit of a sidebar here, but it's good to speak out, like because it's such a part of my point is that it's such it feels like such a obscure mitzvah to so many of us. I certainly didn't grow up knowing about the counting of the Omer. So let's just speak out some more about how it works and answer Hannah's question. And that is to say that you count every day, and because the language in the Torah is Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, that you count 7 complete weeks. So it has to be complete. And therefore, there's this idea that if you miss one day, you don't do the mitzvah. But there's a debate. There's a debate. And some people say, no, the mitzvah is to count whatever day it is. And other people say, no, the mitzvah is to count all of the days. And if you miss one, you've messed up the mitzvah, which I will say makes it this time of year for me is always like, it's the most game show time of year in my calendar because I'm always like, oh, did I do? And I, usually screw up. There's 49 opportunities to screw up. So I usually screw up, but so far I'm in the game. And there's this feeling of, oh, you got to do it every single day. What if you miss a day? Well, if you miss a day, the rule is you can continue to count because some people think it's still a mitzvah, but the concession to those who think it's not is you don't say a blessing over the counting. So you say a blessing every single day and then count. I say day, but you do it at night when you have the first opportunity to count that next day. And and then to really answer Hannah's question, if you forgot at night, then during the day you say it without the blessing, but you can go back to saying a blessing the next day. Okay, that's the basic rundown of your obligations. Count every day with a blessing, count days and weeks. If you count at night, and if you don't count at night, it's okay. If you didn't count last night, you can count in the day and go back to saying a blessing. But if you miss a day completely, then you can keep counting, but you don't say the blessing anymore. Okay, that pretty much summarizes. Okay, so now let's take a look at where are we getting all this from? Why are we doing all this? And really, in some ways, the big point here is why are we still doing this when we're not bringing a grain offering to the priest, which, as we'll see now, is where this all begins. So let's take a look at the offering itself. So here's where it begins. God speaks to Moshe saying, Ki tavo el haaretz, when you come into the land. So it's not something they're in the desert still, but they're talking about future practices. So when you enter the land and you reap its harvest, uktzartem et ktsira, you should bring the first omer of your harvest to the priest. Okay? So that first collected grain you bring to the priest, and he shall elevate the omer before the Eternal for acceptance on your behalf, and the priest shall elevate it on the day after the Sabbath. There's a huge debate here. Let me just pause for a moment and say this phrase, mimacharat HaShabbat, turns out to be a huge debate between the rabbis, rabbinic Jews, and other Jewish sects at the time, in particular the Sadducees, the Tzaddokim, who were many things, but one of the things they were was more literalist in their reading of the Torah. And so Mimacharat Shabbat means literally the day after the Shabbat. But Shabbat is a day of rest and can mean a lot of things. The rabbis understand it to mean the day after Passover, the Shabbat, the resting of Passover. Whereas the Tzaddukim and then later the Karaites understand it to mean, no, it's the day after Shabbat. It says Shabbat, so it has to be the first Shabbat after Passover, you start counting. Now, why do I mention this? Because it actually was a major debate in its time, but also because the implications are significant. If you start counting the day after Passover, which is our tradition, then you'll end up at the same day every year on the calendar for the 50th day, which will be Shavuot. But if you do it on whatever you start counting on the day after whenever Shabbat falls out, that's not the same date. That's based on the day of the week. And so it could be different. The Shavuot as a holiday could move throughout the calendar, right? From the verses of the Torah, you could read it either way, and so this becomes like a major debate. I say all of that also in part because the prominence here of the word Shabbat is one of the things we're going to be paying attention to, and we'll soon see why. But on the day after the Sabbath, and here the rabbis say meaning Passover, on the day after Passover. Now, that is that we'll come back to that usage Shabbat. So on the day after the Sabbath, you bring the Omer to the priest, and you offer a burnt offering and a meal offering, and that's okay. And then this is where the mitzvah begins. So you bring your first Omer. That's where it all starts. You bring an Omer's worth of grain to the temple, and then from the day on which you bring the Omer elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, again, that's the day after Passover in our tradition, you shall count off 7 weeks. Here's where the counting begins. Usfartem lechem mimacharat haShabbat, miyom haviachem et Omer hatnufa, sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiena. You shall count off 7 weeks, they must be complete. Okay, now I'm going to mention, I just mentioned that this debate where Shabbat can mean Shabbat itself or the holiday. Here's another weird usage of Shabbat, and it's important that we pay attention to this. It'll be significant later. When it says 7 weeks, it doesn't say 7 weeks, actually. It says Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, 7 Shabbats. Now, a Shabbat is, again, I said the word can be used in lots of different ways. It can be used to refer to the Sabbath. It can be used to refer to a day of rest, or it can be used to refer to the whole week that culminates in Shabbat. So when we count, for example, Shir Shel Yom, when we say the day of the week, we say Hayom Yom Revi Shel Shabbat. Today is the 4th day of the Shabbat of the week. So the word Shabbat itself can be used in lots of different ways, and that's going to be important to us. But for now, it's just confusing because okay, the day after the Shabbat, which is Passover, you're going to count 7 Shabbats, but really not 7 Shabbats, 7 weeks. Okay. All we need for now is, we've noted that. All we need for now is to note that is to focus on the counting, and the counting so far is you count 7 complete weeks. So what does that mean? Well, it sounds like you count 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 week. So that's actually the counting of weeks comes first, and then the next verse, it's not like we have to go searching for it. The next verse, and again, this phrase, ad mimacharata Shabbat Shvi'it, until you get to the day after the 7th Shabbat, the 7th week, tisperu chamishim yom, you should be counting 50 days. Okay, so the word for counting, you can find it here in the Hebrew, is repeated. And one time it refers to counting weeks, and another time it refers to counting days. And then you bring an offering of new grain to the Eternal. And what do you bring? This is pretty important. You shall bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Mimoshotechem taviu lechem tnufa shtayim. 2 loaves of bread. What is the ceremony when you? I'll read the rest of the verse because that'll give away the answer if you know the reference. What is the ceremony in which you bring 2 loaves of bread? Shnei esronim solet tiena chametz te'afena bikurim laHashem. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour baked after leavening as first fruits to the Eternal. First fruits, first offerings to God. So the first grain of Omer, you bring it and you kind of hold it there, and then 7 weeks later, you have enough grain that you're ready to bake 2 loaves of bread, and you make a 2 loaves of bread offering to the priest. Now, what holiday do you offer 2 loaves of bread, bikurim, the first fruits, to the priest? Some of you know. The answer is Shavuot. Shavuot. And Shavuot, the holiday, what does the word Shavuot mean? Weeks. Weeks. So the festival of weeks, literally, is the festival that is the culmination of the 7 weeks of counting. And on that festival, Shavuot, maybe now, if you're like me, you also didn't grow up knowing what Shavuot was. Passover, Hanukkah, but like Shavuot. So now maybe you have a little bit of understanding. What is Shavuot? Shavuot is the 7 weeks later when you bring the grain that has been presumably first sprouting at the spring festival. Okay? That's Shavuot, and you bring these 2 loaves. Okay, now you see how we count weeks, and you see how we count days, and you see how we get through that counting 7 weeks later to Shavuot. Okay. Now I wanna like share with you sometimes in these classes I write the essay for the week and then I'm done with that and I teach about something else. But this week I really want to share with you what I wrote in this essay because I think it's just really cool and worth, for those of us who are going through this ritual every year and not quite sure what the heck we're doing. I think this parallel story will provide so much insight into the counting of the Omer. But if you've already read the essay, don't worry. We're not going to spend all of our time on it. I want to review it, and then I want to take it to the next level because there were things this is so juicy and so deep. There were things I could not write about in the essay. It was just, my editor told me, this is too much. The people don't have patience for this. But you know who does have patience for it? You people, my Parsha people. Okay, so the legions of people who just want to read the essay, they don't have patience, but we're Parsha people, so we're going to go down to the very depths here. Okay, now where are we going next? Where are we going next? So first of all, I'm going to give you this essay because I guess because I'm proud of it, but also because I think it's because we're not going to review it in total depth, and so if you want to review it after, I think this is the core of our this is the like the really the core Torah, and then we'll build on it. So the core Torah begins by going back to another narrative, another section of the Torah, another story entirely, and that narrative is back in the book of Exodus in Parsha Bishalach. Bishalach meaning, and when he sent them out. Who sent them out? Pharaoh sent the Israelites out. So Parshat Beshalach is the actual Exodus happening. They are leaving. They are crossing the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and how did the Red Sea, Sea of Reeds? I never know that connection. In Hebrew, it's Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and they cross and they make it to the other side, and hooray, the Exodus. Now that's where we find our heroes when, not so heroically, they begin their custom, which is now a well-established custom of the Jewish people, which is complaining. They start complaining about the lack of water and food, and I say complaining, but if I was in the desert without water and food, those would be desperate moments, and I get it. So they start complaining, and first they get water from God, and then God, okay, water, but now God offers something really tremendous, which is that you're hungry, we're going to rain down bread from heaven, the man, or the manna, as we call it, the manna from heaven. God announces, feed the Israelites on their journey through the desert, which will end up being 40 years. God will, every day, bread will fall from the sky. Okay? And this is like one of the great miracles of the Torah. I mean, in fact, the real great miracles of the Torah are back in Egypt. So, once they go out into the desert, a lot of it is just savage, hard, non-miraculous living. But every day they have a reminder of the miracles of God's power in the form of manna. And it all sounds great. It all sounds nice, except that God wants to use this manna as an opportunity to train them to see Hayelich b'torati imlo. Will they follow my Torah or not? What does that mean? Okay, so now we're going to see how they collect the manna, and you will soon see why I'm talking about this story, because what should we find in their very first instructions but an Omer? An Omer. In fact, this is the first Omer that is mentioned in the Torah. It's like, I mean, it's just waiting for us, this Torah. Okay, so let's take a look here. Oh, there's me. I just shared that. Hello, don't I look handsome in my new picture? Okay. Parsha B'Shalach. And Moshe said to them, this is the bread which the Eternal has given you to eat. And this is what the Eternal has commanded. I mean, this is just remarkable. You know, we talk about counting the Omer, but do we talk about the fact that the Israelites just left Egypt, and they, each household, shall gather as much as it requires to eat? Omer la gulgolet, an Omer. Now, what is it? This is strange to begin with, because what are they? They've got measuring sticks out there. Like, does it matter exactly how much they measure? Were they dealing in units of measurement? These are really just like people who have just been liberated, free, just like running out into the desert. But no, an Omer la gulgolet, which literally means a kind of a per head, per skull. Okay, so every person counts an Omer, and they count for as many of you as there are. Now, we were talking just now about counting Omers. Just look at how the very first Omer also has counting in the same verse. And in this case, you count one Omer per person. So what is an Omer then? What is an Omer? That's like the very first Omer we have. What does an Omer represent? Presumably, an Omer represent an amount that a person needs to eat every day, right? A fully grown person. And that's going to be significant because imagine some people eat less and some people eat more, but if you give everybody an Omer, then people will be fine. So maybe the most consuming person will eat the whole Omer, but other people won't. But that's the basic plan here, is everybody gets their daily rations in the form of an Omer. Now that already should have all of our bells going off, and we think, oh, well, then something about this has to do with the later Omer, right? I mean, there aren't that many there aren't that many stories of Omers, and there aren't that many rituals of Omers, so there's something. Okay, but let's make the connection even stronger, and see that the next they do it, by the way. When they measure the Omer, the one who had gathered more had not excess, and the one who gathered less had not taken too little. Each household gathered as much as it needed to eat. So that's great. Now there are two more instructions. One of them is don't leave any over until morning, but they don't do that. They hoard what they have because they're worried, I think, that they won't have any the next day. But that doesn't work. It becomes infested with maggots and worms and rotten. And Moses gets angry, and so then they change and they do gather it every morning. Baboker, baboker, it says, every single day. Now this language is going to become important to us. Every single day, baboker, baboker. You can probably tell where I'm going with this, but this is a daily counting of an Omer. Okay, every single morning. Okay, that's the first instruction, is that there's a daily counting. The second instruction suddenly comes when on the sixth day they gather double the amount of food, and they don't know what's going on, right? They were just told you only get one Omer every day, and you have to use that Omer in the day and then throw the rest away or consume the rest. Do not hold any over for the next day. Then they're told suddenly on the sixth day you get two Omers, and you do hold it over for the next day, because tomorrow Moshe says, is Shabbat. Tomorrow is Shabbat. And this, by the way, this is not a small moment. This is the first time that the Israelites are taught about Shabbat. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath of the eternal. Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh LaHashem. Bake what you would bake and boil what you would boil, and all that is left put aside to be kept until morning. And at first, they don't know if that's going to work because they tried to keep over until morning and it rotted, but they keep this Omer and it works. It keeps. Will God's miracles never cease? Unbelievable. Okay, so then finally, the last thing that Moshe says to them is, so don't go out and you just collect on 6 days. You don't go out on the 7th day. You rest on the 7th day, right? That's Shabbat. That's the whole point. But some of the Israelites think, wait a minute, there's an Omer coming down every single day. I'm going to go out on Shabbat and I'm going to get... So the very first Shabbat was broken as some of the Israelites went out to try to gather an Omer anyway. And there was no Omer, and God gets mad and tells them, this is Shabbat. You got to keep Shabbat. And they finally do, and happily ever after, they start. This is it. This is the pattern for the rest of their desert journey, is that every day they gather an Omer, and on the 6th day they gather 2 Omers, on the 7th day they gather nothing. Very nice, right? Very nice. That story. But of course, and this is like don't worry, I'm not going to talk the whole time. We'll open the conversation soon. But this is the core Torah here, right? Which is, my goodness, there is a story early on in our Exodus narrative, or middle on, I should say. The Exodus has happened, but they have not yet arrived at Mount Sinai. At that space in the middle between the Passover, the thing that Passover celebrates and the thing that Shavuot celebrates, in the period in the middle, we have the Israelites first gathering an Omer, then having to count every single day an Omer, and then beginning a weekly counting, which is constituted of 7 units. Now, I mean, I could just shut the computer off now. That's it. Amazing. There's something, I mean, come on, do I have to convince you? There's something connected here. There's something there's something about the ritual of the Omer that is clearly, maybe not so clearly, but pretty clearly evoking this story. And I spent the essay trying to figure out what it was, but let me just say what the basics are, which is that we have the Omer, and that is a lesson in itself, which is, everybody should have what they need. But then God, and no more and no less, everybody just has what they need. And, this again and again is the Torah's economic vision. It's not make as much money as you want and everybody will, trickle down. Torah's economic vision is everybody should have a basic unit of sustenance, and nobody should collect more than they need. Okay, that's a little economic aside, but the idea then is that when we don't take more than we need for the next day, and when we even trust then that on the 6th day we'll have enough for the 7th day, we are establishing a trust, a faith that God will provide. We can continue to layer meaning onto this, but I think the basic meaning is make sure everybody has enough and trust that God will provide. Okay? So is that what the Omer is about? And, there are more connections we could draw. Remember that we offered 2 loaves of bread on Shavuot, just like they collected lechem mishne, 2 Omers on the 6th day. So I hope I have convinced you now that this earlier story has a lot to say about and about the counting of the Omer, and maybe the counting of the Omer is not just an agricultural cycle that has lost its relevance, but is actually originally a hearkening back to this story. And if all of that wasn't enough for you, if you thought, well, that's cool that you found that connection, but I'm not so sure. If all of that wasn't enough for you, there's then in Parsha Beshalach, in the story, when all of that is done, Moses suddenly commands one more thing, and this really should blow your mind. And it's the kind of thing that you read through the Torah and you don't notice it, partially because it's so weird your mind just doesn't even feel like processing. Why did they do this? So you just move on. But look at what they did there back in the desert. And the house of Israel named it manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and it tasted like wafers and honey. Sounds good. And then Moses said, this is what the Eternal has commanded. Let one omer of manna be kept throughout the ages. Right? Milo haomer enu limishmeret ledorotechem. In order that they may see the bread that I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out from the land of Egypt. And Moshe said to Aaron, take a jar, tzinsenet, and put one omer of manna in it and place it before the Eternal to be kept throughout the ages. And as the Eternal had commanded, Moshe and Aaron placed it lifnei ha'edut, before the pact, to be kept. Okay, now, this is just remarkable. And if you haven't thought of it before, it should, like I said just now, blow your mind. In the Ark of the Covenant, there were two things. There were other legends. You could come up with that. There were three things. There were four things, but there were at least two things, as the Torah names them. There were the tablets with the writings of the Ten Commandments on them, and then there was a jar of manna that was not just a jar of manna, but an omer's worth of manna. An omer's worth of manna in the Ark of the Covenant to remind you of this story. Now, you want to tell counting and a weekly counting and has 7 units that bring you to 2 loaves of bread, right, is not some way of hearkening back to this story. Okay, I think I've done my work here today. I can retire. I can go home. Okay, but all of that is now let's push it one step further and try to figure out one last piece of all this. And if it weren't enough, all the connections that I've made so far, there's one more very strange moment in the Exodus narrative, and I just want to speak it out and then try to work it out with you, because I'm not so sure exactly what it means. I said it's quite remarkable, isn't it? They store a jar of manna in the ark. There's a commandment to do it before they even get the ark, before there even is a revelation at Mount Sinai. It's clear that there's some way we're supposed to remember this story. And then, the story ends, except that there's one bizarre last line. Okay? So I'm going to make one last connection for you, and then we'll see what you have to make of it, which is that's wrong. Sorry. The last connection is the last line, which is that it ends by saying something we don't need to know. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a settled land, and they ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And the omer is a tenth of an ephah. And the omer is a tenth of an ephah, or an ephah. Okay. Now, what? Like, after all that, just a little bit of extra measuring for us, and we didn't, what? That doesn't make sense. Why do we need to know that? Why is that there? Why suddenly going through all these precise an omer? Why did we need an omer at all in the story? But maybe that's setting us up for the counting omer. But why do we need the tenth of an ephah? Okay, but there is of the things we read was that you shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. You shall have an honest balance, honest weights, an honest ephah tzedek, and an honest hin. This is another volume. But the omer is not here, but the ephah is. I am the Eternal, your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt. You shall faithfully observe all my laws and my rules. Okay. Now, okay, I have now 15 minutes left in our class. And I want to spend that time thinking about, like, I hope I've laid all of this out for you in a fairly clear way, but this is not so clear. Why do we have, at the end of all of this, more measurements? The Omer turns into an ephah, and an ephah is one of the units that Parshat Kedoshim says we have to measure honestly. Okay. And that all is pretty weird. So let me just show you, I keep saying one more connection, but just one last thing, which is that in this original story, I kind of glossed over something because it says that they all had to collect an omer every day, and the Israelites did so, some gathering much and some gathering little. But when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered more had not added excess, and the one who had gathered less had not taken too little. Each household had gathered as much as it needed to eat. So now, that line, remember, there were 3 tests. There was the test of gathering the right amount. There was the test of gathering every day and not hoarding. And then there was the test of not gathering on Shabbat. They failed the last 2 tests, but I said that they passed the first test. But that is not what Rashi thinks. Rashi thinks that that language, that some gathered more and some gathered less, Rashi says that what really happened is that there were some who gathered much and there were some who gathered little. And when they came home, they measured it by an omer, and they found that he who had gathered much had no excess over an omer, and this was a great miracle. In other words, they didn't gather the precise amount. Some gathered more and some gathered less, but God made a miracle to show them, no, you can only count an omer's worth. Okay, so it's not clear whether they measured precisely to begin with or not, or maybe they were greedy and tried to take too much, and other people were selfless and tried to take too little. Okay, now, what? Okay, now where does all this leave us? Well, what I want to end our time reflecting on is this last piece of precise measurements. I have laid out for you a connection, I hope, a believable connection between the story of collecting the Omer in the desert and the ritual of collecting the Omer. But now I just want to, you can read the essay for yourself, but now I want to just focus on the idea of precise measurements and why it matters, because even in the Torah, the language of measuring is used. They measured by the Omer. They measured by the Omer. Vayimodu ba'omer. They measured by the Omer. And the measurement then reveals either that they had not been measuring precisely, as Rashi says, or, as other commentators say, according to the plain meaning of the text, some gathered more and some gathered less according to the number of people in their tents. But our sages say, no, this is another example of them not following instructions. Okay, and then we get all these instructions, all the instructions of the hin and the ephah and the tenth of the ephah and the omer, and then in our own ritual years later we have all of these other instructions which include omers, and by the way also include a hin. Look at that, there's the hin. This is a volume of a unit of volume of liquid, a hin. So, okay, this is really unfair what I've done here, which is that, like, I've set up an entire architecture, and then I raised one last complicated question, and then gave you 10 minutes to think about it. But that's the way the class is going today. So we are finally ready to not hear my booming voice. Let's hear from some of you. First of all, just about the whole connection. You're welcome to speculate on it all. But like I said, I wrote a whole essay on that. Or put that essay in there's the essay for anyone who wants it. Or more importantly, for our purposes today, what do we make of this last hanging line that tells us that an omer is 1/10 of an ephah, especially in light of the fact that later we learn that we have to, by mandate of the Torah's Kedoshim code, we have to measure a phot and the hin precisely. Okay, this is a very unfair class, but here is your final 10 minutes of working through all the material that I've been spewing at you. And let's start with Kathy Kobayashi.
Okay, so I think this business of, is it a precise measurement or not, is, I mean, I think there's a prior question, sort of like, what do you define as precise? And I think that maybe we're thinking precise means exactly the weight, the grams or the liters or whatever. And precise might be precisely what people need, not precisely this cup or this measure. And so that people getting more or less could still be precisely what they need, because as you said, the measure of the Omer was in the previous, in Bashalik was, people get what they need. And some people need more than others. And it's, like you're at a restaurant and everybody gets served the same amount, but not everybody eats their whole meal, and some people do. I mean, it's just it just totally makes sense to me that that's it. So it actually kind of adds to the, I don't know if you call it miracle, but if then you say that, once it gets to God, it's all right. It's sort of like the miracle is miracle, I don't know. Is it there's a way in which we know what people need. I mean, that's not such an easy thing to know, but to know that is really pretty amazing. And so I guess the other thing I'd say is that this business of measure, we have this, I think, kind of limited way of looking at things. And this is just a kind of a comparison is that I've read that there were societies in which hours were measured as a proportion of daylight, so that the length of an hour could vary depending on the exact day. And so it's a measure, it's a meaningful measure, but it's not what we think of the measure. So anyway.
Okay, this is so great. So really always grateful for Kathy's insights. And this is really a great I was a little worried, as you could hear. Oh my gosh, if I set this all up and there's like now it's going to be hard to really, find insights in this last 10 minutes. But Kathy has definitely provided us with a whole reframe here, which I think is possible and would be quite profound. Just like re-articulate some of what Kathy already said well, which is that this idea of measurement inevitably suggests precision. Measurements themselves are about exactitude, but it is possible to read, and the fact of the debate over how much they actually took, it is possible to read this phrasing as everybody being allowed to take as much as an omer, but certainly everybody is supposed to take only as much as they need. And in fact, some of the commentators say this. I said this earlier. What about kids? Did they also get an omer and they just threw it out? And some of the commentators say, no. Of course, kids took less because they didn't need as much. So an omer becomes a kind of a precise cap. But look at the language here, and this really supports, I mean, the fact is you can read it in multiple ways, but it certainly supports Kathy's reading that this is what God commanded, liktu mimenu, gather from it, ish lefi ochlo, a man according to what he eats. Omer la gulgolet, one omer per head, mispar nafshotechem, for the total number of lives, ish asher be'ohalo, that a person has in his tent. That's what it oh, okay, I'm back. Did you hear me? I was not seeing anyone. You can take a max for each of them, but you would also just take ish lefi ochlo, every person according to what they can eat. And that provides us with a different kind of reading of the next line here. And so they did, and some took more and some took less because they didn't actually need a full Omer for everybody. But when they measured by the Omer, meaning when they used the Omer as a standard, then that would keep people from not going way, way overboard. But it doesn't mean precise measuring. It means measuring by a standard which allows us to all have what we need. And I'll just add one more thing to Kathy's really incisive comments here, which is that a lot of we think of measurements as precise. But Kathy was starting to say this, an hour can be represented in different ways. Is it 60 minutes or is it 1/12 of the daylight? So that's one way of thinking of measurements differently. And one of the other standard measurements in Jewish tradition is an amma, right? And an amma was measured as like an arm's length, an amma, like about this length. And that means an amma could be different for different people. Just like a foot used to refer to an actual foot, and feet are different sizes. So maybe it's like that you're measuring by your own omer or your own right. And now on the other hand, there are some very precise 1/10 of an ephah is an omer. So I don't want to brush aside the precision language, but Kathy's got a very good read here. Let's hear if one or two more. Let's start with Noah.
Yeah, on the whole measurement part, it's just so many details that it it just goes over my head. But with relation to them gathering and then in the Emor part, it's saying 7 Shabbases, and now we have two Challahs on Shabbos. I think there has to be also a connection there, and it's all leading to Shavuot, which is coming soon. So there's obviously that connection, but the Shabbat one is more interesting to me because we're measuring the 7 Shabbases, and we always have the two Challahs on Shabbos. Do we get a 4 Challahs on the Shavuot Shabbos? I don't know.
Okay, great. All right. So Noah returns to the sort of first part of our analysis and fills out some of the details on the parallelism between the counting of the Omer and Shavuot. And I just want to speak out some of what Noah said there quickly because look, we're going to leave here, and as Noah's saying, we're going to be in this process of counting the Omer and heading toward Shavuot. So let's just make sure, without forcing you to read the essay, that make this, I think, really meaningful. I mean, the suggestion that I'm offering here is that the counting of the Omer is not just a holdover from agricultural days, and it's not just a precise ritual counting. It is a way of taking us back to those first moments after we crossed the Red Sea. We're free but starving, and scrounging around for food, we suddenly had to confront this reality that we were going to have to rely on God. We were going to have to, and I think this is important too. We're going to have to we're going to have to take care of each other, to give each other each as much as we needed, to not hoard too much for ourselves. And then we're going to actually have to rely that God will provide enough for us all. And those are both very difficult things to do. And so we go through this process like our ancestors did of counting days and then weeks, learning those two counts. And the language of Shabbat, Shabbat, Shabbat in our counting of the Omer is also evocative of what we arrived at, which is that very first Shabbat, which will become, one of the greatest institutions that our people have. And we do that by counting in cycles of 7, right? And so Shavuot is like a kind of 7 weeks representing the 7 days, where we offer the 2 loaves just like we had 2 loaves on Shabbat. But the other thing that Noah's suggesting here is that Shavuot is the day that now it isn't that day in the Torah. In the Torah, it's not clear what Sabbath and keep it holy. Sheshet yamim tavod v'asit et kol malachtecha. You shall work 6 days, and then on the seventh day is Shabbat. Where did they learn that? Just a few chapters earlier, when they were counting the Omer every day and then getting to Shabbat. So you see how, like, there's a, some people would say that the rabbis decided that Shavuot is the day when we receive the Torah, but there is at least a narrative connection between the pre-Sinai and the post-Exodus. That period is exactly what the Omer, the counting of the Omer, is meant to take us back to. Okay, that leaves us with one last minute. Anyone got a 1-minuter? I always regret this when I try to squeeze in 1 minute, but let's try it. Allison, 30 seconds. We can't hear you.
Okay, I'm here.
30 seconds.
I'm here. It kind of reminds me of like when someone is getting sober, the one day at a time, the counting, and the connection between kind of that trust in God, having faith and taking things just one step at a time.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. And really, and actually, you offer us a really lovely place to close, because there is, remember, like, great significance to the 7-day cycle in our tradition. I'm just highlighting Shabbat, the importance of Shabbat. And so that means, like, measuring time is a big part of our tradition, measuring time. And then maybe, yes, measuring units and measuring. There are many ways that measuring actually becomes a holy act in our tradition. But part of what's beautiful about the Omer ritual and the original story is that it isn't just about Shabbat. It's also about the daily, every day, the Sheshet Yamim, the counting of every day. And that teaches us, first of all, the specific lesson that Shabbat isn't just about the seventh day. It's about the 6 days leading up to Shabbat also. And that's why we call the whole unit a Shabbat. And that, as Allison is suggesting, that offers us two kinds of spiritual lessons. One is that we can very carefully and measuredly, precisely lead up to a sacred moment, and if we prepare for it. But it's also true that Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, that every day we're following God's Torah. Every day we're trying to live righteously. Every day we're trying to take not more than we need, but also not to abuse ourselves, and to be conscious of this day. Thank God I have what I need, and like that is enough. So even if you haven't been counting the Omer till now, even if you don't say the blessing from here on out, you always have today, and today is the 23rd day of the Omer, and just be present in that moment. So thank you all for coming on this wild ride, and for more, check out the essay. And good to reporting to you live from I think it's Rancho Cordova, California, at Juan's house. Love you all, and see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.